And now we're in a situation with a debt pile of about 2.8 billion that's owed to creditors, probably just as much that is outside, with increasing probably allocation of monies that is going to things like gambling. And I think the proportion of our incomes that is needed to service this debt that is via the Credit Act and outside is getting higher and higher. See, any amount of money you borrow is good debt, in my opinion, if you are going to use it to make more money. If you are borrowing purely to repay previous debt, that is not a good use of money. That's bad debt. If your debit orders are bouncing, that means you don't have enough cash to cover it, then you know that you overstretch yourself. And my golden rule is do not spend more than 30% of your take-home pay combined on debt repayments, period.
Welcome everyone, another episode of Frankly Speaking. I'm really excited today to have Benay, who's head of DebtBusters, join us on the call today to talk about debt, which I'm sure many of you have either experienced firsthand, the good and the bad sides of credit. But the purpose of today is really to focus on, I think, some of the practical tips on how to identify good and bad debt, how to recognize if you're in a good situation or a bad situation in terms of your total sort of debt load. And then if you are in a bad situation, maybe some practical tips on how to get out of it. But yeah, Benay, it's great to have you on board. You've got so much experience in this space. It really is, I feel like I'm going to be learning a lot from you today, and that's really kind of the intention. So maybe to kick us off, if you could just give us a sense of, in your experience, in your view, kind of where is the state of kind of debt in South Africa, like at a macro sort of landscape level?
I think our primary experience in DebtBusters is via restructuring a personal debt. And, I started this I started with the company around 2013. And at that stage, I think the outstanding debt pile of the consumers in South Africa was about 1.7 trillion. Now it's almost it's 2.8 trillion. And of course, our population has grown along that time, and that's 12, 13 years ago. So some of it is normal, inflation linked. But when you look at the actual credit active population over that period, it barely budged. I think it was about 22 million, and now it's about 24 or 25 million. And I think what that signals is that that's just what's on the credit bureau, what's available, what's known. There's also another set of debt, which is, things that are, I wouldn't call them off the books, but off the credit bureau. So, for example, monies that is owed to, in some situations, private schools, small practices, businesses, monies owed to, for example, for rates, to state entities, SARS and so on, even SABC debt. All of that has also grown over the period. We don't actually know exactly by how much, because those are not really reported. We don't really know how much money is owed to SARS, for example, from this consumer base. We just know that it's a large number. But the point is, what you've seen is, I think, up until 2015 or so, there was a healthy growth, particularly in government subsidized jobs or government direct jobs, in terms of state employment. Since 2015, that's really dried up. And in some ways, government employment stayed about the same, or in fact less. There may be even fewer people directly employed by government. But the people's needs haven't gone away. And as a result, the debt pile with government employees and with everybody else has increased. Now, COVID and the shutdowns that came with COVID were the great accelerators in this. And what seems to have happened is, for many people since then, if they were deemed to be a good lending prospect, they had good credit scores and so on, more and more lending has taken place to those individuals, whereas those at the in the lower end have been lent less and less. And this was driven by COVID, but it was actually initiated, I would argue, by the 2016-2017 something called debt intervention or debt relief bill. There was a lot of talk about writing off up to 50,000 rands worth of debt that was unsecured, and that actually, I think, turned off a lot of the lending to the low end, particularly from retailers thinking, oof, if you lend now, that may never be paid back. And I think on the back of that, the lower end lending, it was further curtailed with COVID. And now we're in a situation where, fast forward to 2026, I think we're all feeling good about ourselves, quite confident, and never mind the events of the last 2 weeks. But going into 2026, the SA consumer was feeling quite confident, and with a debt pile of about 2.8 billion that's owed to creditors, probably just as much that is outside, with increasing probably allocation of monies that is going to things like gambling, which we talked about before. And I think the proportion of our incomes that is needed to service this debt that is via the Credit Act and outside is getting higher and higher. And that's where we find ourselves in. We can get into the exact numbers, but I would summarize the situation as such.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And of that 2.8 trillion, I mean, 2.8 billion, yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't really have a full appreciation of all the different types of debt that exist out there, right? Everything from credit cards to like home loans. So maybe if you can just touch on like what is that split between sort of secured debt and unsecured debt? Yeah, are you seeing any trends there in people taking on? And then maybe just to add to that question, how do people get into debt? Some debt is very planned, if you will. I'm going to buy a house, I'm going to take a home loan. And other debt is consumption.
So it is 2.8 trillion. Forgive me if I said billion before. I just want to correct myself. It is 2.8 trillion. It is. I mean, it's normal when you look at the size of it and divide by the number of people. It doesn't look so bad. About 65 to 70% of it would be home loan debt. So it's predominantly tied up in mortgages. A huge majority of it. About 15 to 20% would be tied up in vehicles and other. Some of the things like furniture that's sometimes considered as an asset base. I mean, we can debate whether furniture is an asset or not. That's we don't have enough time in the day to go through with that. But the rest will be personal loans and credit cards and outstanding store card debt and all of that. So, the majority of it, because home loans take up such a big portion of it, it's there. Now, how do people get into it? The way that I used to think there was a simple distinction between, well, what's good and what's bad. I think in reality, any amount of money you borrow is good debt, in my opinion, if you are going to use it to make more money. What does that mean? If you are going to use it to invest in your own education, that's going to allow you to get a better future for yourself, for your child, whatever it is. That's good debt. You may not pay off immediately. If you are going to use it to, let's say, get a vehicle, because the vehicle is going to enable you to cut back on your travel time and allow you to get access to a better job because the conditions require such, that is good debt. If you're going to use it for getting yourself in a house, which, by the way, is the only appreciating asset we can talk about. Generally, house prices appreciate over time. Not always, but generally speaking, that's good debt. If you are going to borrow that money to buy stuff that is going to be, let's say, out of fashion in 6 months, that's probably that wouldn't be a good use of money. If you are borrowing purely to repay previous debt, that is not a good use of money. That's bad debt. So I think we can probably simplify it for things like that. There will be some gray areas that's kind of difficult, but I think in a nutshell, that's what I want to leave the people listening to this with. If you are borrowing money, that you're going to use that money for a purpose that's going to further your financial situation in the long term, it is a good reason. If you are using it for consumption purposes, depending on what it is, sometimes it's necessary, it's probably not the best use of money.
No, I think it's a very nice way to think about it. On the car stuff, though, I do think it's interesting. You hear often of stories of young guys or young people generally starting job, and obviously one of the first things they think about is like now they have access to vehicle financing. The cars, the banks will offer them really good terms, and everyone's obviously this is their first job, their first car. They have lots of dreams, so instead of getting the really practical, Hyundai Getz or like Toyota Corolla, they go in for a BMW. So again, there's some gray area there. Like both can get you from A to B. One will do you in style and have a lot more obviously cost and debt associated with that. But maybe let's sort of segue into kind of the next section, because I think a lot of people have debt, right? Whether that's a store card, a credit card, vehicle, home loan, etc. But like, what are the warning signs that people should look out for when they think that they might be taking on too much?
Yeah, I think I mean on your vehicle point particularly, because often I think vehicle is it ends up being the sort of warning sign. It's you know, you're taking on too much if something unexpected happens and you cannot cover it. So let's say, again, sticking with the vehicle, um, you know, often particularly our young people don't really factor in the various costs associated with owning a vehicle. When you own a vehicle, that vehicle has a warranty and maintenance plan for a few years. It's not infinite. And vehicles are designed in such a way by engineers that, like, what, they have a finite life. That generally parts will work well if you're using it, you know, normal wear and tear for about 4 or 4.5 or 5 years. Beyond that, you start basically needing to put more money in. But even before that, you're going to need new tires, depending on how you use it. There's other consumables that you will need. You know, your car needs insurance. There may be some other things that you want to do. For example, clean your car from time to time. Whatever it is, it comes with extra things. And most importantly, of course, is fuel. Now, if, you know, 2 weeks ago, uh, uh, we were looking at the value. You know, a barrel of oil was $63. Now it's over $100. Now, what does that mean? We're going to feel those shocks almost immediately. It's not going to go up by probably 40%, hopefully in April, but we are going to feel that, and we're very sensitive to it. So that's one example. So if you are unable to cover unexpected costs, then you feel like you overstress yourself. Before we get to that, if you are finding yourself that you really watching over, you know, every single SMS that tells you money has gone out of your bank account, and you're worried that your money in and money out is going to be basically equal to each other in 1 or 2 days after you get paid, that's generally a warning sign. If your debit orders are bouncing and you're getting charged for them, by the way, and you will see this almost immediately, banks are very good in charging you for any bounced debit orders or debit checks. In fact, they make a lot of money from this. If something is bouncing off your account, that means you don't have enough cash to cover it, then you know that you overstretch yourself. If you're avoiding phone calls from debt collectors, definitely a sign. And I think most importantly, you instinctively will know you're going to lose sleep over the financial stuff. It's the first thing that worries of. It's going to take a toll on your relationships. It's going to take a toll on your work performance. And you're going to see all of this. If you see deterioration in those, you certainly have overstretched yourself. And then you have to take a step back and ask, okay, where can I, you know, get a better handle? And often, I mean, to jump into it, we want people to think about 3 areas. One is, can you adjust your income, you know, improve your income, have additional sources of income, have a side hustle, this, that, and the other. You know, that's the first area people think about. Often, unfortunately, in this, they will go straight to, well, I can't do any of those. I need to borrow more money. So before you get to that, so hold your horses. I think that's a very important point. So improving your income is one potential way of dealing with money in, money out sort of discrepancy. The second way of dealing with is looking at your expenses. You will find that you may be overpaying for some things. You can get the same volume for less price, or you can do without, or you can trade down the quality, or you can change your spending patterns and all of that. And you can pool your resources with others. So expenses is a big second area that we want people to think about, particularly when it comes to things that you're buying from retailers. Pretty much all of our retailers have fantastic cashback or rewards type programs. Use them wisely to such an extent that you're getting more out than what you're putting in. That's the second big area. And the third one, which almost never anyone thinks about, is where what we do, our core business in DebtBusters, is restructuring of the debt repayments. Debt repayments, depending on who you ask, will make somewhere between 40 to 70% of your monthly take-home pay. And there's a recent report by 80/20 that shows in Q4, I think on average it was something like 42% of South Africans would need, on average, South Africans would need 42% of their take-home pay to service their debt. Now, this is an average, so you got to be careful, but that's a big chunk. That money that you're spending or you're needing to spend can be restructured, especially if it's owed to you know, non-creditors. Like and often that's something that people don't think about. You know, that is a big chunk of money that people consider to be not addressable, but we'd like people to also think that that could be addressable depending on your circumstances. So don't just treat it as something that is untouchable, but rather make a plan across these three areas: income, expenses, and debt repayments, to see if there's stuff that you can do to really help you get ahead of the curve.
And I think the strategies for paying down debt, and I think for me it's interesting because I agree with you. There is value in credit, right? Whether that's for investing in your education, in an asset, increasing your financial circumstance. I do know though, a lot of people, when they get into a bad debt situation, they just panic. I have to get rid of debt. This is so bad. And it becomes a more of a binary kind of reaction. I mean, I got into that situation in my student years. I had a scholarship, and along with the scholarship, they gave me a credit card, and I was traveling, I was living a great life. And then all of a sudden, I just didn't have the ability to pay that off. And the compounding interest on that credit card, like, really gave me a big fright. And my initial reaction, in my 20s was like, I'm never going to go anywhere near debt ever again. And the problem was I missed out, I think, on investing wisely in property in my 20s. I wish I'd done that in Cape Town. Obviously, it would have been a great investment at the time. But and I think when I look back on that situation, it was only because my reaction to getting into that very stressful debt situation was so stark. It was so dramatic. I was like, have to get rid of this. So maybe we can be a little bit more subtle in terms of helping people. It's like, not so much how do you get out of debt, but how do you manage your debt? How do you get into a good debt situation as opposed to a very anxious one?
Yeah, it's a great topic, and I think I fully agree with you. I mean, there's no way that okay, maybe a few people could afford to buy a house outright, but there's no way that overwhelming majority of us would ever be able to afford a house unless we got a mortgage from the bank. And of course, it works for everybody, because over the 20 or 25-year term of the loan that you would get from the bank makes a lot of money, and you are the proud owner of an asset that, again, over time, usually appreciates. So, and without debt, it's really difficult, without taking on credit, which becomes debt, by the way, it's really difficult to build an asset base purely from what you're going to earn from your salary. I think that's just a fact. It's very, very difficult. It's not impossible, but it's difficult if you want to have, especially in this day and age where many of us would be thinking about retirement programs with defined contributions as opposed to defined benefits. It's going to be very difficult to find a place where, unless you borrow some money to have extra investments or invest in your house or whatever, it's going to be difficult to get ahead of the curve and actually prepare for yourself a bit of money for the retirement. At the same time, the question I always get asked is, well, how much of my income should I spend? And my golden rule is, do not spend more than 30% of your take-home pay combined on debt repayments, period. And I know that a lot of banks would not like hearing that, because they will tell people you can spend 30% of your take-home pay on just the mortgage alone. The problem with that is, for some people that will be okay, but for a lot of people, particularly the first-time home buyers, I go back to the shocks that we experienced in 2020, 2021. Interest rates were very low, so a lot of people got into the market for the first time. And then all of a sudden, in 22, 23, interest rates started ratcheting up to such a place that they could not afford it anymore. Because when you still have 18, 19 years to pay on your mortgage, every 25 basis point increase for you is going to hurt a lot, because you're still paying a lot for your interest. So you're going to be very sensitive to that. So if you can limit what you're spending to 30%, then you can build a bit of a buffer, let's call it 5 to 10% for yourself. So in case you need to ratchet up a little bit more, you can be fine. So we'd like people to commit themselves to no more than that. And of course, there will be exceptions. I mean, it depends on how much you're earning. But generally, what we found is, and now I think DebtBusters has helped probably about 250,000 people over the last 12, 13 years in terms of their finances. What we see time and again is people need almost always 2/3 of their take-home pay for life. They need it to pay for their food, to pay for their transport. They need it for their kids. They need it for their schooling and everyone. So assume that 2/3 or 67%, technically speaking, is committed to life, whether that's for putting money aside for your retirement, this, that, and the other. then you should really be concerned with the 30% that remains for your debt repayments. We see this time and again. And it actually, surprisingly, doesn't really matter what the income level is. It's almost always consistent. So I would say arrange your debt and borrowing in such a way that, as much as possible, you're not exceeding that 30% take-home pay. And that gives you the best chance in terms of setting yourself up for future success.
And at a very practical level, I mean, just, I'm thinking about how I would do this, right? So I'd be looking at my bank statements. I'd be looking at all of my debt repayments, that go off on a monthly basis. I'll sum that up to get me a total figure. And obviously, is that how that compares to the ratio? I know people can access your credit score. Most of the platforms have a sort of a free report that they will give you. Do they give you your kind of like total payment in there as a sort of as an easy figure? Or would you have to do the hard work, the modeling and the Excel spreadsheet yourself?
I think it depends on which platform you use. So of course we have our own, not to punt our name, but I think credit bureau information it depends on how it's presented back to the individual. Either individually it will be listed in terms of your monthly repayment amounts, or there will be an aggregate. In our case, we do present an aggregate to show to the individual. But sometimes that might also include things like, let's say, cell phone contracts and insurance payments, which makes it a little bit difficult to disaggregate, but you'll have to take those out and say, okay, what are my debt repayments? People can go to our website and look at this, but you don't have to use ours. I think the point is, from any credit bureau report, you should be able to see what your monthly obligation is. And let's take someone who's taking home 15,000 Rand. That's the amount of money that drops into your bank account. So what I'm saying is, for a person like that, they really shouldn't be spending more than 4,500 Rand per month on debt repayments. Okay, if a push comes to shove, maybe 5,000, but even that's, I think, and why? That's just providing you at least a bit of a leg up and a bit more room that you're going to need for everything else. So I think from a practical perspective, let's think of it like that.
Yeah, and I think again, like I really like that 30%. Just so you know, and I think possibly a way to think about then is like, okay, if you look at just your debt situation and you say, okay, well, I've invested in this house, this is my home, that's not going to change, but maybe there are a whole bunch of other debt practices or kind of debt, profiles that I could probably pay down, a store card here that actually, or a credit card there, whatever the case may be, just to see how you can whittle your way back into that sort of like 30% kind of comfort zone. Because I think the tragedy, and then we see a lot, obviously, as you know, with Franc, people can save and invest. And one of our most popular savings goals, if you will, is for an emergency fund. We advocate very strongly that people have between 3 to 6 months of their salary available, in a money market fund. It's earning, a good interest rate, but you can access that money very quickly in case of emergency. And because it's a little bit of a separate fund, you're not sort of tempted to kind of dip in it from a simple consumption basis. But we generally see a lot of people actually are not that well prepared. So when the emergencies come around, people are having to borrow basically to deal with life. I don't know if there's anything you want to kind of comment or add on how to maybe avoid situations like that, or if you find yourself in a situation like that, what is the smart thing to do?
Yeah, I do. I've always liked the concept of an emergency fund, and I like the fact that you put a cap on it in a way, like, because people can also read too much into it. Like, you also don't need like 1 million Rand in an emergency fund, right? I mean, we're talking about emergencies. So depending on what your situation is, have a bit of a buffer. I did want to pick up on the earlier point you made, which is, I think also people ask, well, I have these 6 or 7 or 8 accounts with various interest rates and various amounts. Which one do I pay off first? And my answer to them is, it depends on whether you want your mind to win or you want your heart to win. Okay, and let me just explain. If you want your mind to win, pick the one with the highest interest rates and then say, I'm going to attack that guy first. I'm going to pay that first because in the long term, that's what's going to cost me. If you want your heart to win, to feel like you've got to win, attack the one with the lowest balance, just clear that off, get it off your plate, and then you will feel like you've actually had a win. So it depends. I mean, there are different strategies that you can employ to create the room for yourself, to also create a bit of an emergency fund, because it's so crucial. going back to the point we made earlier about vehicles, often there will be a need, vehicle related need, and people will not have the money to actually do some sort of basic, really important stuff on a vehicle. And actually that creates more danger. It's a more risky situation. So I think it's a great idea that I think you're helping people hopefully get to a stage where they are saving 3 to 6 months worth of salaries somewhere that is easily accessible to them.
Yeah, I really love that idea of whether you want your mind to win or your heart to win. It's such an appropriate way to think about it.
Yeah.
And I mean, a simple thing, when we've spoken to a lot of clients, a lot of people don't even know what interest they're paying on a particular on debt. Is there an easy way, or where can, should they be going looking for the statements? Should they be going back to the original credit agreement? Like, what's the easiest way to kind of get an inventory on the interest rate you're being charged?
Your original credit agreement will certainly have the interest rate, or it will tell you, if it's a home loan or if it's a vehicle, it's linked to the repo rate. It will tell you what the multiple of the repo rate would be. Often you can also see it for things like credit cards. It usually will tell you on the monthly statement. But generally, either your bank monthly statement for that particular account, that shows you whether it's a home loan or vehicle finance agreement or credit card or whatever personal loan, it should have the interest rate on there to tell you. And it's going to be somewhere between probably 12% and 25%, most likely. And then I think the decision becomes yours. Okay, like if I want to pay down or pay off something, which one do I tackle first? Which is where we get back to the heart or mind discussion. I think it's up to, it's difficult to be, I think one can be overly prescriptive about these things, and we prefer not to be, because we also understand many people's situations are different.
Yeah, I know, 100%. But I think it's interesting because when we talk to our clients about investing, the one figure, if you will, that we push is like your net return. What are you getting after fees? Like, if there's one number that you care about when you're looking at all of your investments, it's like, what is the net return? And I think that when it comes to credit, the interest rate is that one figure, right? This is the sort of like the benchmark for you to understand. Obviously, there are admin fees and there are other things, but there's always complexity. So, at least, when I talk to clients, it's like, if there's one thing that you focus on when it comes to credit, is like, what is the interest rate? And similarly, I imagine you would also advocate, like, if you're shopping around, if to buy a house, to buy a car, like, that's what you should be comparing, going to different providers and being like, what will you give me? What interest rate will you offer me? And then again, that becomes your metric for comparison.
Absolutely. I think people do generally a good job of comparing that when it comes to borrowing for a house. I don't think people do as good of a job when it comes to vehicles. I think often there's a temptation when you go to the dealership. The first question you're asked is, what are you looking to spend on a monthly basis? The interest rate doesn't factor anywhere. And in fact, that might be in the very last point when the person will tell you, oh, by the way, you're signing this agreement and your interest rate will be X, Y, Z. But they already allowed you to make the emotional connection to that particular vehicle. It's going to be really hard for you to now walk out of that showroom and say, oh man, I want to go look for an alternative, because that's more of a heart discussion. It's not a mind discussion. And I think even less so when it comes to personal loans. Unfortunately, a lot of the personal loan borrowing is happening on under very acute circumstances. So you feel like you are stuck and you have to get the large amount, whatever that is, 50,000, 100. We're even seeing 300,000 Rand personal loans. Because it's an acute decision, it has to be made because you have a need. You're unlikely to go shop around and actually ask the interest rate. You're just happy to take the amount. People focus too much on the account and not enough on the interest rate. And I think that's if I could have my wish, I mean, that should be the first question everyone should ask. What's the interest rate I'm getting from this? And then shop around, at least get 2 quotes. You don't have to get 10, but at least get 2 so you know which one is better.
Yeah, 100%. And I think let's, segue from that, because I think talking about good habits when it comes to sort of like managing debt. I think there's a lot that we can say on this, or a lot that I want to say on this. And I think that you rightly said, like, shopping around, just do it simply. Try in that moment, wherever you may be, try to remember that little bit of rationality. Like, let me just get a second quote. The other thing, which, I suppose was a piece of advice before I bought my first house that somebody gave me, is as much as you can, especially on a home loan, is put money early on into that home loan, right? So sort of don't just pay the minimum, because by pushing more capital into that, there are two benefits. One is, very often, assuming it's an access bond, you actually have your emergency savings sitting in that access bond, and it's a very efficient way, because you're generally kind of getting, the interest rate is higher in that access bond, so it's an easy place to store your emergency fund. But secondly, is the cost of capital. So how much you will be charged, or how much you effectively pay for that asset over the long term, is a lot less. I don't know if there are any other kind of habits, or you want to comment on that.
I think that's a great one. I mean, let's do the numbers practically. The best sort of consumer in South Africa will get, let's call it prime minus 1.5% interest rate on their home loan. Right now, as we sit here, prime is 10.25%. So minus 1.5 is 8.75. So if you put money into your bond, it's an access account, you are guaranteed to get 8.75% per annum return on your money. It's as simple as that. You are guaranteed. You have to do nothing. You just have to put the money there and park it. You would be pretty hard pressed to find many other options that will give you guaranteed return. And of course, if your interest rate is higher, for most people, by the way, it would be prime plus 1.5%. Then you're also looking at almost like 10, 11% guaranteed return rate. Now, I would really challenge many of us to find other places where you can have guaranteed. And this is a very practical example of that. I love the concept of, if you can, putting more money into that account, because it helps you in the long term.
Although, any last sort of like thoughts, just to leave our sort of viewers with, your parting comments on managing debt, being a good debt citizen. Any last thoughts, Benay?
Yeah, I think just to like maybe bring in a few of the concepts we talked about. So I think we should accept that credit is good, and if used responsibly, it can really like open up. I mean, we can argue capitalism is based purely on credit. I mean, without credit, we wouldn't have a lot of development and stuff. But we have to use it responsibly and not waste it away. So if we are using it responsibly, going back to the good debt versus bad debt conversation, it could really open up a lot of doors for us. At the same time, from my observation, where people get stuck is they ignore the warning signs and they leave it too late. When you're finding like you are debt stressed early on, the earlier you try to tackle it, the more options you will have. The longer you wait, the fewer your options become. And in the end, you almost have to take almost like a bit of a nuclear pill, you kind of forced into a particular solution that is not going to be one of your choice, but it will be one of your necessity. So I think the best way of tackling it is just recognize the signs we talked about early. Just try to do something about it earlier on when you have broader set of options, and before the debt actually escalates out of control. Then you will feel like you can actually manage it and bring it to more of a sustainable place. And I think if a lot of the people listen to the advice we have given about sticking to, let's say, 30% of their take-home pay, that would be, of course, detrimental to the DebtBusters business, don't get me wrong, but people will be in so much better financial health. And we would love to see that. I mean, that's the reality. We would really love to see that, because then we can actually pump a lot of the money into development things. Often people end up borrowing on their own names, for example, for their companies. And then when they over borrow, then they also don't have a credit line for their own company. So things can also get pear-shaped, not just for yourself, but if you're a small business owner, for the people you're employing and for everyone who's believed in you. So I think we need to understand the repercussions of it. And of course, pay on time, pay as much as you can. If you are if you're not going to be able to pay, and if you tell the people you owe money, you're not going to be able to pay in that month, more than likely they'll work with you to find a solution for a period of time. I think the worst thing to do is just avoid the payments and just kind of, pretend that they were not there, because that's where you end up in really difficult debt situations. So I think that's probably some of the practical advice that we can give to everyone. Hopefully they'll follow it.
Yeah. It's so often that I've reflected. I mean, I think I mentioned to you, I spent a lot of my early career in the health space, health technology. And this idea of your health and your debt, your credit, being very similar concepts. People don't want to deal with a health issue very often, and men in particular,
Yes.
until it's too late. And as you say, it just decreases the options available. Actually, if you are far more proactive, you can prevent situations from developing. And as you say, you just keep your options open. I think that's a lovely way to think about it. And Benay, I just want to thank you, man. You've given us some lovely ways to think about, getting on top of your debt, either listening to your mind or to your heart, sticking to that 30%. Some useful tips in terms of like getting on top of, your whole holistic debt situation, finding out, what is going on. And obviously, it goes without saying that if you do find yourself in that desperate, as you say, that nuclear situation, that you guys are DebtBusters are the largest sort of debt relief company in South Africa. You've been around for a hell of a long time. You've got an incredible reputation in a difficult time. So helping customers navigate a very extreme reality. So yeah, I love what you guys are doing, and it's really been an honor and a privilege and a pleasure having you on the call and being able to talk with you on some of these tricky issues.
Thank you for having me, and the feeling is mutual. I'd love to, we love talking to you about what you are doing. I think it's so pivotal in terms of helping, particularly our young people, get to where they should be getting to, in terms of prosperity in the long term. It's great. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks very much, Benay. Thank you. That's our another episode of our Frankly Speaking. Join us again, where we continue to unpack as much as we can about all of the complexities that exist in the world of money and finance. Thanks.